A poor girl sells artwork to fund her chemo treatments, painting through trembling hands while cancer ravages her body. But when Senator John Kennedy accidentally stumbles into her world, what he does next gave her a reason to keep living. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. The crash of paintings scattering across the sun-scorched pavement shattered the humid stillness of Magazine Street, New Orleans. Hannah Miller watched heart sinking as her watercolors, weeks of labor born from pain, skittered across the sidewalk like shattered hopes. Her knees hit the concrete, a jolt of pain spiking through her weakened frame, but it barely registered. Her eyes were fixed on her paintings, a lighthouse smeared with dirt, a crescent moon torn at the edges, a paper kite soaring against a golden sky now crumpled under a stranger's shoe.
"No, no,"
she whispered, voice cracking as she reached for the kite painting, its vibrant hues dulled by a footprint. This was for Tuesday's treatment. That one, the bayou at dusk, was supposed to cover my meds. "I'm so sorry," a man's voice cut through her despair. "I wasn't watching my step. Let me help." Hannah looked up to see Senator John Kennedy, his face familiar from news clips, already kneeling to gather her scattered artwork with steady, careful hands. His suit was crisp-tailored, but his demeanor was warm, grounded, like someone who belonged to this city as much as its oak-lined streets. Behind him, her makeshift easel lay toppled victim of his hurried misstep as he navigated the bustling sidewalk. But anger didn't rise in her, only a crushing exhaustion that made her want to stay there crumpled on the hot ground and let the world move on without her. "It's okay," she said, her trembling hands betraying the lie. "Accidents happen." Kennedy paused, his gaze catching the shake in her fingers, not from nerves but from something deeper, more relentless. He noticed the medical alert bracelet glinting on her wrist, the way she moved as if every action was a calculated expense of energy. "These are extraordinary," he said softly, holding up the painting of the paper kite, its colors still vivid despite the smudge across its corner. The image, a girl tossing a kite into a boundless sky, her face alight with hope, seemed to hold him for a moment. "You painted all of these?" Hannah struggled to her feet, swaying slightly under the weight of the Louisiana sun, its heat pressing against her like a physical force. "Every single one," she said, forcing a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I might need to paint faster now. Medical bills don't care about accidents." Her attempt at humor fell flat, weighed down by the truth she couldn't hide. Each painting was a lifeline, a desperate bid to buy another week of treatment, another day of life. Kennedy studied her, the strain in her breathing, the way she braced herself against the fallen table for balance, her thin frame barely holding her upright. "How much for this one?" he asked, still holding the kite painting, his voice gentle but deliberate. $40. Hannah said, then, noting the quality of his suit and the quiet authority in his presence, added quickly, "But I could do 30. "I'll take 5, Kennedy replied without hesitation, his southern drawl softening the edges of his words. 200 for all of them. Hannah's breath caught pride, clashing with desperation in her chest. $200 could cover a week's worth of medication, maybe 2 if she stretched it. But the offer felt too generous, too much like pity, and her pride bristled at the thought. "You don't have to do that," she said, voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed on the ground. "This isn't charity," Kennedy said, his tone warm but firm, carrying the conviction of someone who'd spent years advocating for others. "These paintings have heart. They'd mean something on my office walls, remind me of the people I'm here to serve. People like you, Hannah." She looked up, startled that he'd overheard her name from a nearby vendor's greeting. His eyes held no judgment, only a quiet sincerity that made her want to believe him. She hesitated, then nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. As she began wrapping the paintings, the kite a bayou sunset, glowing with purples and golds. A lone figure standing under a street lamp, a bridge over calm waters reflecting a fading sky, and two hands reaching across a void. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each one a battle against the fatigue that clung to her like a shadow. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper around the canvases, and a medical bill slipped from her bag, fluttering to the ground. The $39,000 balance, stamped with angry red past-due warnings, glared up at them like an accusation. Hannah snatched it up, shoving it back into her bag, her cheeks burning with shame. "I need to go," she said, voice tight, avoiding his gaze. "My meds, they make me drowsy without food, and I missed breakfast." "When did you last eat?" Kennedy asked the question, catching them both off guard. His brow furrowed concern, etching lines into his face. Hannah frowned, trying to piece together the blur of the past day. "Yesterday, I think," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Nausea makes it tough to keep anything down." Kennedy pulled out his phone, his movements quick but calm. "There's a po' boy stand just down the street. Best shrimp in New Orleans. What can you manage?" "I can't let you." "You're not letting me," he interrupted, a gentle smile breaking through his drawl, softening the insistence. "We just made a sale. Let's call it a celebration." Minutes later, they sat on a shaded bench under a sprawling oak, its branches heavy with Spanish moss. Hannah nibbled a plain piece of bread, the only thing her stomach could tolerate, while Kennedy sipped iced tea, his eyes discreetly watching her struggle to take even small bites. The wrapped paintings rested between them, a fragile bridge in the humid air, their edges curling slightly in the heat. The sounds of Magazine Street buzzed around them, street musicians playing, jazz vendors calling out to tourists, the clink of coins in a tip jar, but for a moment it was just the two of them, sharing a quiet space amid the chaos. "Lymphoma," Hannah said abruptly, breaking the silence, her voice flat but raw. "Stage 3. Diagnosed 6 months ago, right after art school. I had big plans, galleries, exhibitions, a real career. Then this." She gestured at herself, a bitter edge creeping into her words. "Each treatment costs thousands. Insurance covers some, but not enough. Never enough." Kennedy listened, his face calm but attentive, his hands folded around his cup. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened, letting her words fill the space between them. When she paused, staring at the crumbs in her lap, he spoke softly. "So you paint," he said. "You take that pain and turn it into something beautiful. That's no small thing, Hannah." "It's not enough," she admitted, her voice breaking as she stared at the ground. "A few dollars here, 10 there. It keeps me going, but it's not enough. I'm always one treatment away from losing everything." He nodded, his eyes reflecting a depth of understanding she hadn't expected. "When life gets heavy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "I've found that doing something for others, something real, helps carry the load. Your art does that. It's not just paintings. It's hope, Hannah. It's a piece of you that reaches people." Her eyes stung, tears threatening to spill, but she blinked them back, refusing to let them fall. "Hope doesn't pay for chemo." She said the words sharp but fragile. "No," Kennedy agreed, his voice steady, "but sometimes it brings people who can help." The weight of his words hung in the air, simple but profound. Hannah didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the kindness of a stranger who saw her not as a victim, but as an artist, a person with something to give. She looked at him, at the man whose face she'd seen on campaign posters and news segments, and wondered why someone like him, someone with power, influence, a life so different from hers, would stop to help a street artist on a sweltering afternoon. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the city wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Kennedy finished his tea, setting the cup down carefully. "You're out here every day?" he asked, glancing at her small setup, the folding table, the weathered stool, the remaining paintings propped against a lamppost. "Most days," she said, "unless it's a treatment day. Those knock me out for a while." He nodded as if filing the information away. "I'll be back," he said, standing and brushing off his suit. "Your work deserves to be seen, Hannah. Don't give up on it." She watched him walk away, his figure blending into the crowd, the paintings tucked under his arm. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something like hope stirred in her chest, not enough to banish the fear, but enough to make her pick up her brush again. That night, Kennedy couldn't shake the image of Hannah's trembling hands, the way her paintings had scattered like broken dreams across the pavement. He hung the paper kite painting in his office, its hopeful glow standing out against the stark walls. It wasn't just art. It was a story, a fight, a testament to resilience. He thought of his own work, the long hours spent advocating for his state for people who needed a voice. Hannah, he realized, was one of those people. Her strength, her art reminded him why he'd entered public service in the first place, to lift up those who were fighting battles most would never see. The next morning, he was back on Magazine Street, finding Hannah at her stand, her brush moving slowly across a new canvas, despite the fatigue etched into her face. "You're persistent," she said, a faint smile breaking through her voice, lighter than the day before. "I've got an idea," Kennedy said, pulling up a crate to sit beside her, his suit jacket draped over his arm in the morning heat. "Our community center has bare walls, lobby meeting rooms, all of it. Your art could fill them. I showed your paintings to some colleagues yesterday. They're interested." Hannah's brush paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. She'd heard offers before, ones that came with hidden expectations, promises that faded as quickly as they were made. But Kennedy's gaze was steady, his expression open, devoid of any agenda. "That's kind," she said cautiously, "but I don't need pity." "This isn't pity," he said, his voice firm but kind, that familiar drawl grounding his words. "It's about giving talent, like yours, a stage. Your art speaks, Hannah. It deserves to be heard. Will you let me help?" She studied him, weighing his words against the skepticism born of too many disappointments. Her body ached, her hands shook, and the weight of her medical bills loomed like a storm cloud. But something in his voice, in the way he looked at her art, made her want to believe him. "What if I can't finish?" she asked, her voice small. "The treatments, they take a lot out of me. Some days I can barely hold a brush. Then we'll show what you've got." Kennedy said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "One painting from you is worth more than 100 from anyone else. Art, like yours, it's not about quantity. It's about truth." Hannah exhaled a spark of hope, piercing the weariness that had settled into her bones. She didn't know if she could trust this man, this senator who seemed so out of place on her gritty street corner. But she was tired of fighting alone, tired of carrying the weight of her illness and her dreams without help. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady for the first time that day. "Let's do it." Kennedy smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt like a promise. "Good," he said. "Let's get your work out there. You're not just painting for yourself anymore, Hannah. You're painting for all of us." As he walked away, Hannah picked up her brush, her hand still trembling, but her heart a little lighter. She didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if this chance would change anything. But for the first time in months, she felt seen not as a sick girl, not as a charity case, but as an artist with something worth sharing. And that, she realized, was enough to keep her painting at least for one more day. The morning sun filtered through the oak trees, lining Magazine Street, casting dappled shadows across Hannah Miller's modest art stand. She sat on her weathered stool brush in hand, working on a new watercolor, a quiet marsh scene with herons standing sentinel in the mist. Her hands trembled slightly, the familiar ache of her illness creeping into her fingers, but she painted anyway. Each stroke was a defiance, a refusal to let lymphoma define her. The memory of Senator John Kennedy's visit the previous day lingered, his words echoing in her mind. "Your art speaks, Hannah. It deserves to be heard." She wasn't sure if she believed him, but the $200 from his purchase had already paid for a week's worth of anti-nausea medication, and that was enough to keep her going. The street buzzed with its usual rhythm vendors, hawking beignets, tourists, snapping photos of historic storefronts, a saxophone's mournful notes drifting from a corner. Hannah glanced at her remaining paintings, propped against a lamppost. A jazz musician lost in his melody, a garden of magnolias under moonlight, a single figure rowing across a glassy lake. Each one was a piece of her, a fragment of hope painted through pain. She wondered if Kennedy would really return, or if his promise was just another fleeting kindness from a stranger who'd forget her by tomorrow. "Hey, artist," a familiar voice called, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Senator John Kennedy approaching, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder in the rising heat, a paper bag in one hand and a warm smile on his face. "Thought you might need some fuel," he said, setting the bag on her table. The scent of fresh cornbread wafted out, simple and plain, exactly what her stomach could handle. Hannah blinked, caught off guard. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice a mix of gratitude and suspicion. She wasn't used to people coming back, let alone bringing food. Kennedy shrugged, pulling up the same crate he'd sat on yesterday. "Had an extra from a breakfast meeting," he said, though the bag looked freshly bought from a nearby bakery. "Figured you could use it more than my staff." He leaned back, watching her work, his eyes tracing the delicate lines of the herons taking shape on her canvas. "That's beautiful," he said. "Reminds me of the marshes out near Lake Pontchartrain. You ever paint out there?" "Not lately," Hannah admitted, setting her brush down to open the bag. She broke off a piece of cornbread, nibbling cautiously. "Used to before. All this." She gestured vaguely at herself, the medical alert bracelet catching the light. "Hard to carry a canvas when you're fighting to stay upright." Kennedy nodded, his expression thoughtful. "My granddaddy used to take me fishing in those marshes," he said, his southern drawl wrapping around the memory like a warm blanket. "Said the herons were the keepers of the quiet, standing still watching the world go by. Your painting's got that same stillness. Makes you stop and breathe." Hannah paused, surprised by the poetry in his words. She'd seen him on TV, all sharp suits and sharper words, debating policy with a folksy charm that made people listen. But here, sitting on a crate in the middle of Magazine Street, he seemed different, less like a senator, and more like someone who understood what it meant to hold on to beauty in a hard world. "Thanks," she said softly, not sure how to respond to someone who saw her art the way she did. They sat in companionable silence for a while, Hannah painting, Kennedy watching the street come alive. A vendor across the way waved at him, calling out, "Senator, you campaigning out here?" Kennedy chuckled, waving back. "Just supporting local talent," he replied, nodding toward Hannah's stand. The vendor grinned, giving Hannah a thumbs up, and she felt a flush of warmth and a twinge of unease. She wasn't used to being noticed. Over the next few days, Kennedy became a regular presence at her stand. He'd show up in the mornings always with something small, a bottle of water, a bag of fruit, once even a thermos of gumbo he swore was just leftovers. Each time he'd sit and talk asking about her paintings, her process, the stories behind them. He never pushed, never pried too deep, but his questions were thoughtful, pulling out pieces of her she'd kept buried. She told him about art school, how she'd dreamed of filling galleries with her work, how her parents had passed when she was young, leaving her to fend for herself, how the diagnosis had come like a thief, stealing the future she'd planned. "Your paintings tell those stories," Kennedy said one morning, holding up a canvas of a cracked road winding toward a distant horizon. "This one, it's like you're saying, keep going even when it's broken." "That's powerful, Hannah." She shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just paint on paper," she said. "Doesn't fix anything." "Maybe not," he said, "but it makes people feel something. That's more than most can claim." His visits started to shift something in her. The exhaustion was still there, the pain a constant companion. But Kennedy's presence was like a small anchor grounding her against the chaos of her illness. He didn't treat her like she was fragile, didn't look at her with pity. Instead, he talked to her like an equal, someone whose work mattered. One afternoon, as she worked on a painting of a streetcar glowing in the rain, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about that idea I mentioned," he said. "The community center. We're planning an event, a showcase for local artists. I want you to be the centerpiece." Hannah's brush froze mid-stroke. "A showcase," she said, her voice wary. "Like a gallery show?" "Exactly," Kennedy said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We've got space connections, people who'd pay good money to see work like yours. We could turn it into a fundraiser. Get your art in front of collectors, maybe even some gallery owners. Your paintings deserve more than a street corner, Hannah." She set her brush down, her heart racing. The idea was thrilling, a real show, a chance to be seen as an artist, not just a sick girl scraping by. But doubt crept in, cold and familiar. "Why me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "There are plenty of artists in New Orleans. You don't even know me." Kennedy leaned back, unfazed by her tone. "I know your art," he said simply. "And I know what it's like to see someone fighting a battle most folks can't imagine. I've spent years working for people who need a hand up, not a handout. Your work, it's not just beautiful, it's honest. People need to see that." Hannah looked away, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, wanted to grab on to this chance, but years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. "What if I can't do it?" she said, her voice barely audible. "The treatments, some days I can't even get out of bed. What if I let you down?" "You won't," Kennedy said, his voice steady. "And if you can only manage one painting, that's enough. It's not about filling walls. It's about showing the world who you are. One piece of truth from you is worth more than 100 from someone else." His words hit her like a wave, washing away some of the fear that had rooted itself in her chest. She thought of the community center, of her paintings hanging under proper lighting, of people seeing her work and understanding the stories she'd poured into each one. But another thought nagged at her pity. She'd seen it before, people offering help because they felt sorry for her, their kindness tinged with condescension. "I don't want this to be about my illness," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not a charity case." "And I'm not treating you like one," Kennedy replied, meeting her gaze. "This is about your talent. Your story's part of it. Sure can't separate the artist from the art, but what I see is someone who paints through pain, who creates beauty when most would give up. That's not pity, Hannah. That's respect." She studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. His eyes were steady, his voice grounded in a conviction that felt real. She thought of the medical bills piling up in her tiny apartment, the constant fear of running out of time, of money, of strength. Accepting his offer felt like a risk, like opening a door she'd kept locked for years. But something about him, his quiet persistence, his belief in her made her want to take that chance. "Okay," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll do it, but only if it's about the art, not about me being sick." "Deal," Kennedy said, a grin breaking across his face. "But you're gonna need to paint a few more of those herons. I've got a feeling they're gonna sell out." Hannah laughed, a small, unexpected sound that felt foreign in her throat. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of possibility, like the first brushstroke on a blank canvas. Kennedy stood brushing off his pants. "I'll get the ball rolling," he said. "We'll need to talk logistics, space-timing, promotion. You focus on painting. I'll handle the rest." As he walked away, Hannah picked up her brush, her hands still shaky, but steadier than before. She looked at the marsh scene on her easel, the herons standing tall in the mist, and added a new stroke, a faint glow on the horizon, the promise of dawn. She didn't know if she could trust this senator, this man who seemed too good to be true. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. Over the next week, Kennedy's visits became a routine. He'd stop by with coffee or a sandwich, always claiming it was extra from a meeting, though Hannah suspected he was buying them just for her. They'd talk about art, about New Orleans, about the little things that made life bearable. He told her stories of his early days in politics, the people he'd met who'd shaped him, the fights he'd taken on for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She told him about the first time she'd picked up a brush, how it had felt like finding a language she'd always known but never spoken. One afternoon, as she worked on a painting of a jazz band under a streetlight, he sat quietly watching her blend colors with a precision that belied her trembling hands. "You know," he said, "when I was younger, I thought success was about winning debates, passing laws. But the older I get, the more I realize it's about moments like this, helping someone like you shine." Hannah paused her brush, hovering over the canvas. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "You're a senator. You've got bigger things to worry about than a street artist." Kennedy chuckled, leaning back on his crate. "Maybe," he said. "But the big things start with the small ones. You're not just a street artist, Hannah. You're proof that people can keep going, keep creating no matter what. That's the kind of story I want to tell." She didn't respond, but his words settled into her like paint seeping into the grain of a canvas. For the first time, she began to see her art not as a means to survive, but as a way to connect, to inspire. And as Kennedy left that day, promising to check in on the community center plans, she felt a shift, a quiet strength growing inside her, fueled by his belief in her. By the end of the week, Kennedy had rallied a small team to organize the showcase. He'd called in favors, reached out to local art collectors, even pitched the idea to a news outlet looking for human interest stories. Hannah spent her days painting, pushing through the nausea and fatigue each new canvas, a step towards something bigger. The fear was still there, the uncertainty of her illness, a constant shadow. But with Kennedy's encouragement, she began to believe that her art could do more than pay for chemo. It could change her life. The community center on Magazine Street glowed under the soft light of strung lanterns, its usually plain lobby transformed into a vibrant gallery. Hannah Miller stood near the entrance, her hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. Her paintings lined the walls, each one framed and lit with care. The paper kite soaring into a golden sky, the bayou sunset with its purples and golds, the lone figure under a street lamp, the bridge over calm waters, and the hands reaching across a void. The centerpiece was her newest work, a watercolor of two figures standing in a field, releasing a paper kite into a dawn-lit sky, their silhouettes blurred but hopeful. It was her and Kennedy, or at least the idea of them, bound by a shared moment of possibility. The air buzzed with anticipation as people began to arrive, art collectors in tailored suits, local journalists with notepads, community members curious about the event Senator John Kennedy had been promoting for weeks. Hannah smoothed the borrowed dress she wore, its fabric loose on her thinning frame, and adjusted the scarf covering her scalp bare from chemo. She felt exposed not just because of her appearance, but because her art, her heart was on display for strangers to judge. Her stomach churned a mix of nerves and the lingering nausea from her last treatment. Kennedy appeared at her side, his suit impeccable, but his smile warm, familiar. "You ready for this?" he asked, his southern drawl cutting through her anxiety like a breeze. No, Hannah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they hate it? What if no one buys anything?" He chuckled, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Look around, Hannah. They're already captivated." She followed his gaze. A couple lingered before her bayou painting, whispering about its colors. A journalist scribbled notes near the street lamp piece, her face thoughtful. An older man in a tweed jacket stood transfixed by the kite, painting, his eyes misty. Hannah's breath caught. She'd never seen her work through others' eyes, never realized it could move people. For so long, her paintings had been about survival, a means to pay for chemo. But here in this moment, they were something more. The idea for the showcase had come together faster than Hannah had expected. Kennedy had worked tirelessly, rallying his staff to transform the community center, calling in favors from local businesses for catering and lighting, even convincing a prominent New Orleans gallery owner to attend. He'd kept Hannah's illness private, as she'd asked, focusing instead on her talent. "This is about your art," he'd told her during one of their planning sessions. "Let it speak for itself." And now it was. As the crowd grew, Kennedy took the stage, a small platform set up near the kite painting. The room quieted all eyes on him. "Good evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying that easy charm that made him a beloved figure in Louisiana. "We're here to celebrate art that tells stories, art that lifts us up. Hannah Miller's work does just that. Every painting you see tonight came from her hands, her heart. Take a look, and I promise you'll see something worth keeping." The crowd applauded, and Hannah felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to hide, but Kennedy's steady presence kept her grounded. He stepped down, joining her again, and whispered, "Told you they'd love it." The next hour was a blur. People approached her asking about her inspiration, her technique. A woman in a red dress bought the bridge painting, saying it reminded her of her childhood. A collector offered $500 for the street lamp piece, calling it hauntingly honest. Hannah answered their questions as best she could, her voice growing steadier with each conversation. But the pain in her bones, a side effect of her latest treatment, gnawed at her, and she leaned against a wall, trying to hide her fatigue. Kennedy noticed. He always did. Without a word, he handed her a glass of water and a small pill, her pain medication, which he'd learned to carry after seeing her struggle. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," she said, swallowing the pill with a sip. "But also amazed. I didn't think anyone would care." "They more than care," he said, nodding toward the crowd. "They see you, Hannah. Your vision, your fight. They see it all." As the evening wore on, the gallery owner Elise Dubois approached. Her sharp eyes and elegant posture marked her as someone who knew art. "Ms. Miller," she said, "your work is remarkable. The emotional depth, the use of color, it's raw but refined. I'd like to offer you a solo exhibition at my gallery next spring." Hannah froze, the words echoing in her mind. A solo exhibition. Spring. Months away, a future she hadn't dared imagine. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say yes," Elise said with a smile. "New Orleans needs your voice." Before Hannah could respond, Kennedy stepped forward, his grin wide. "She'll say yes," he said, giving Hannah a playful nudge. "Won't you?" Hannah managed a nod, her heart pounding. The crowd's hum faded as she processed the offer, a chance to be more than a street artist, to be seen as a professional. But doubt lingered. Could she keep painting through the treatments? Could she live up to this? As the night neared its end, Kennedy took the stage again, his presence commanding attention. "Folks, I've got one more thing to share," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Hannah's art isn't just beautiful, it's a testament to courage. What many of you don't know is that she's been painting through a battle with lymphoma, every sale going toward her treatment. Tonight, thanks to your generosity, your purchases, your donations, we've raised enough to cover her medical expenses in full. $72,000. The room erupted in applause, gasps rippling through the crowd. Hannah's legs buckled, and she sank into a nearby chair, her hands covering her face. Tears came not from sadness, but from a relief so deep it felt like breathing for the first time. The weight of those bills, the constant fear of falling behind it, was gone. She looked up to see Kennedy watching her, his eyes soft with understanding. He stepped off the stage, kneeling beside her chair. "You did this," he said quietly, "just for her. Your art brought these people here. I just gave you the stage." "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't," he said. "Just keep painting. Keep living." The crowd began to disperse, but a few lingered, offering words of encouragement, buying the last of her paintings. Elise Dubois promised to follow up about the exhibition, pressing a business card into Hannah's hand. As the center emptied, Hannah stood before her kite, painting its spotlight, casting a warm glow. Kennedy joined her hands in his pockets. "That's my favorite," he said. "Reminds me of you launching hope into the unknown." Hannah smiled, her first real smile of the night. "It's us," she said, nodding at the new painting of the two figures. "You gave me a reason to keep going." Kennedy shook his head. "You had that reason all along, Hannah. I just helped you see it." As they left the center, the New Orleans night humming around them, Hannah felt lighter, not cured, not free of pain, but unburdened by the fear that had defined her for so long. With Kennedy by her side, she began to believe her art could carry her forward into a future she was ready to fight for. The New Orleans sun rose over Magazine Street, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, much like one of Hannah Miller's watercolors. Months had passed since the community center showcase, and Hannah stood in her small apartment, staring at a new canvas, a girl releasing a paper kite into a vibrant sky, the horizon glowing with possibility. Her hands still trembled, but less from illness now and more from the quiet excitement of creation. Her latest scans showed progress tumors, shrinking remission, a word the doctors dared to whisper. The $72,000 raised at the showcase had erased her medical debts, giving her the freedom to focus on healing and painting. But it was more than money that had changed her. It was the friendship with Senator John Kennedy, the man who'd seen her art and believed in her when she'd lost faith in herself. Hannah's days were no longer defined by fear. She painted with purpose, her work now featured in local galleries with the promise of a solo exhibition at Elise Dubois's gallery in the spring. But what meant the most was the quiet routine she'd built with Kennedy. He still stopped by her stand, Though she spent less time on Magazine Street, now her art selling steadily through galleries. When he visited, it was with a coffee or a story, his southern drawl weaving tales of New Orleans history or his work in the Senate. Their talks were a lifeline grounding her through the ups and downs of treatment. One afternoon, as they sat in a cafe near the French Quarter, Hannah sketching in a notebook, Kennedy leaned back, sipping his iced tea. "You've come a long way," he said, his yeases tracing the sketch of a jazz band she was working on. "Not just the art, the way you carry yourself. Like you're not just surviving anymore." Hannah smiled, setting her pencil down. "I owe a lot of that to you," she said. "That showcase, it didn't just pay my bills. It made me feel like I could be more than my illness." Kennedy shook his head. "You were always more, Hannah. I just helped you see it." Their friendship had grown into something steady, unspoken, but profound. They didn't talk about it, but it was there in the way he checked in after her treatments, the way she gifted him a small painting of a heron for his office. It was there in the moments they shared, like when they walked along the Mississippi, discussing art and resilience, or when Hannah taught him to mix watercolors, laughing as he smudged paint on his tie. Inspired by Kennedy's kindness, Hannah started a workshop at the community center teaching art to people facing their own struggles, veterans, single parents, kids from tough neighborhoods. She saw her own fight in their eyes, and sharing her craft felt like giving back the hope she'd been given. "Art saved me," she told them. "It can hold you together when everything else falls apart." One evening, as the workshop ended, Kennedy joined her, watching as a young boy proudly showed off his painting of a boat. "You're building something here," he said. "Not just art community." "That's what you did for me," Hannah said, cleaning her brushes. "You showed me I didn't have to fight alone." The lessons of her journey crystallized in those moments. Loneliness had once defined her, the weight of her illness isolating her on that street corner. But Kennedy's act of kindness, stopping to pick up her paintings, seeing her art, believing in her, had shown her that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was how people survived, how they thrived. And art, she realized, was more than paint on canvas. It was a bridge connecting hearts, healing wounds. Hannah stood before her latest painting, The Girl with the Paper Kite, now finished. At its base, in careful script, she'd written, "Hope only flies far when others help it soar." It was her story, their story, hers and Kennedy's, a testament to the power of compassion. She turned to him, standing beside her in the community center's quiet gallery. "This one's for you," she said, "for showing me what hope looks like." Kennedy's eyes softened. "You showed yourself, Hannah. I just held the light." As they left the New Orleans night alive with music and laughter, Hannah felt whole, not cured, not yet, but whole in a way she hadn't thought possible. Her art, her fight, her friendship with Kennedy. They were proof that kindness could change a life, that connection could heal. And she knew wherever her journey took her, she'd carry that truth forward, painting hope onto every canvas, trusting others would help it fly. This is what we learn from Hannah's story. Kindness from a stranger can spark a miracle. Accepting help isn't giving up. It's opening the door to possibility. Art, community, compassion. These are the threads that weave us together, turning pain into purpose. So go out and be someone's light. Share a kind word. Lift up a struggling voice. Because hope doesn't fly alone, it soars when we help each other rise.